Hello, everyone. Welcome to the UWCD Career Webinar with Parents today. My name is Amrita Singh Kesi, and I am the University and Career Counselor at UWC Dilijan. And thank you very much for joining us today for the session. I work as a university counselor at UWC Dilijan, and my role as a university counselor is to help students transition from high school to the university and help them with their applications to wherever they want to apply to, and guide them through that process to find a best fit for their undergrad studies. Today, for this career choice session, we have special guests with us. Dr. Parvez Modi and Mr. Gudmundur Johnson, who will be sharing highlights of their careers and give advice on how to navigate life after graduation. May I please request Mr. Gudmundur and Ms. Modi to please switch on their camera. Thank you so much. We are especially grateful to Mr. Johnson, for whom I believe it is nighttime in Korea. Thank you so much. Our session is going to be quite interesting today, given that our speakers are both parents. They have the children at UWCD. Both are connected to UWCD in other ways as well, and both work in education. So we look forward to their insights today. Before we start the session, it's a bit of a housekeeping. Apart from the Zoom session we also have a live session on Facebook. And after our speakers make their contributions, we'll then go to the questions Q&A sessions, which you can actually put in the chat section if you have any questions, or you can also comment on Facebook, which will be addressed during the end of the session, of course. We plan to have this session for about 45 minutes. Let's begin. Let's start with Dr. Parvez Modi, of course, Jai's mother too. So Parvez is a social anthropologist who teaches and works on kinship and care at Cambridge University. So Ms. Modi, please tell us about your education and career path and how you became an anthropologist and an educator.
Hi, thank you, Amrita, and thank you for inviting me to this session. So I suppose in terms of your question, I grew up in India and I went to school in India, and then heard about UWC very accidentally, as many people do. At the time, there were newspaper ads that used to be placed in the Indian newspapers to advertise scholarships to the UWC, and somebody I knew had seen this ad and they told me to go and look for the ad, and I went into the pile of like old newspapers in my home and found the relevant day and found the ad, applied, and to my amazement got selected. And so I had never left India before. I went to Atlantic College with another Indian student, both of us on scholarship. And it was a completely, shocking and exhilarating experience. It was like everything I had imagined it would be, very exciting, full of adventure. And and that's what I was in it for. So I got everything that I had hoped for from that time in Atlantic College. It was a very different time. It was in the late 80s, early 90s. And in those days, we still had service. And my experience of service at UWC was very firmly implanted in my psyche, I think. And I think that was anyway the bit of UWC that really attracted me to it in the first place. And so subsequent to AC, I went off to work in outward bound Southern Africa. I got a job. There was some volunteering opportunities in outward bound Lesotho, and I seized them. I wrote off for it, and me and another student from the school got selected to go to Southern Africa. At the time, my family was completely gobsmacked. I mean, they didn't know where Lesotho was, and they were really traumatized, really, that I had disappeared off the horizon as far as they were concerned. And for me, it was just the most exciting and, again, like super amazing time. Sadly, it was cut a bit short because I had my mum fell ill, so I had to go back to India and attend to things, and landed up, having to leave that sort of halfway through. But very excited to be back in India and sort of thinking about the future. I enrolled in college, but I also started working with environmentalist human rights group in central India. I got very involved, very interested in what I was doing, and began to see that some of the social science education I was receiving in India was not really up to the same standard even that the IB had got me going on. So, the fact that I was being taught to think in the IB was a new thing for me when I'd come to Atlantic College. And in some ways, it was feeling a bit retrograde to be told stuff and told to memorize stuff again, which is how social science in Bombay, which is where I was. I've subsequently understood that, there are some very good social science institutions in the rest of India, but sadly at the time. So I applied to go abroad again and landed up in Cambridge. I applied to the US as well, got some places, some scholarships, but basically I was having to go for wherever I got a full scholarship, and luck would have it, it was Cambridge. And I embarked upon an undergraduate degree quite soon after I began the degree, which was social and political sciences. I realized that my true love was anthropology, and actually that a lot of the things I'd been thinking about and troubling myself with were anthropological questions. So I remember going into my first lecture for anthropology, which was part in those days of that social and political sciences tripos. I literally at that first lecture, I just went, this is it, I know what I'm doing here. But until that point, I had no idea where my career was going or what I was doing. I was interested in studying and I wanted to learn. And that was a really good reason to be at university. But beyond that, I had no answers. And in a sense, finished my undergraduate degree, felt that I hadn't quite finished learning enough anthropology, so decided to do a PhD. And then landed up working as an anthropologist also in Cambridge. So in some ways, lots of travel in the early bit of my life, and then sort of much more stagnant in the latter part. So that's how I landed up being at Cambridge. Gudmundur, you should take over and tell us how you did it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Parvez. Mr. Johnson, it's over to you. Let's hear from you.
Oh, thank you, Amrita. Thank you, Parvez. What an amazing journey you've had so far. My name is Gudmundur Johnson. I'm from Iceland originally, and have grown up traveling the world with my parents, who set their sights for traveling the world. Excuse me. And in essence, I'm a third culture kid. And I've continued being a nomad as an adult, traveling the world. So here I am in Seoul currently in South Korea, working with amazing educators and amazing students in a British International School in this incredible city. But my journey, I guess, really started in Iceland, as I say. My parents left Iceland when I was about 5 years old, and my father did a master's degree in Edinburgh, and then we moved, of all places, back in 1976 to Saudi Arabia, to the Red Sea city of Jeddah. And I grew up there, and a most amazing experience. And then eventually wound my way back to Iceland and finished my sort of secondary education in Reykjavik. And when it came to the question of what to do, I know that so many of the young people, of course, now in Dilijan, my son is there as a first year, Alexander. When it comes to the question of what to do, where to take your life, the next steps of university, I think some people, young people, will often find this to be such a huge question. And of course, it is important, but it's also important to realize that this is not the be all and end all of the rest of your life. You will probably find, as I have found in my own life, that the choices that you're making, there's certainly no guarantees that you'll end up being, or that your career will follow the pathway of your undergraduate degree. So when I was in Iceland, choosing to do or thinking about this question, what shall I do? My passion, well, the two passions really, it was music and archaeology. And so I chose archaeology. So I went to London. I studied at University College London. I did an undergraduate degree in archaeological science, and then was very fortunate to then be able to go back to Iceland and work for the National Museum of Iceland, specializing mostly working mostly on Viking Age and medieval sites. Of course, that is what you mostly have in Iceland, because Iceland was colonized by the Vikings in the 9th century AD. But my specialism eventually became archaeological science, so reconstructing past habitats and climates through the study of environmental evidence, such as beetle remains, Coleoptera. So that's what I did for a number of years. And then I was most fortunate, whilst in Iceland, to study music. So there were evening classes offered at the Reykjavik Academy. And so I've always been singing. So I studied in the evening classes there. And then my teacher eventually said, Gudmundur, it's time for you to go and audition. So I went to London and auditioned for the schools there and was accepted. I think I was 32 years old at the time. And so I got to pursue my second passion, music, in London. So I studied at the Royal Academy of Music. I studied as a bass vocalist, and have been able to perform and on a variety in lots of different places as a bass vocalist. So I still try and sing when I can. And it was whilst working or living in London that I got the opportunity to actually go on an excavation one summer in central Turkey on a Neolithic site there. And this is a most incredible place called Çatalhöyük, right in the center of Turkey. One of the earliest sort of permanent settlement sites in the world, dating back to about 7,500 BC. And on the excavation team, there was another archaeologist who is now my wife. And we have together embarked upon a career in education. There's a twist in the tale of my wife is from Belgrade, and I moved to Belgrade to be with my wife Katarina, or wife to be Katarina. And at the time, this was just after the war in the former Yugoslavia, and I was working at the academy, the music academy there, working with young opera singers, up and coming musicians. The most amazing experience. And then unfortunately the salary was so low there that I couldn't make ends meet. I literally could not pay back my student loan to the Icelandic government. And lo and behold, there was a British international school in the city of Belgrade. And I got my first teaching job there. And in that school, there was a mentor who took me under his wing, who had worked at Gordonstone's. He had retired and then come out of retirement in education because he was so thoroughly bored. Landed a job in Belgrade, and he introduced me to Kurt Hahn and the UWC movement. So right from the get-go, from the outset of working in education, Kurt Hahn and the UWC movement was on my radar. And then after having worked at that school in Belgrade, I got the opportunity to go to Rome. And then eventually, via quite a long route, I eventually ended up in Norway, being the rector of the United World College Red Cross Nordic, which was just the most amazing experience, being there with my wife and our two children. And I think that's ultimately where my son Alexander, that's where he got the UWC bug. So hence him being now in Dilijan. And I continue to support the UWC movement in any way that I can. So I support the Serbian National Committee. So my son has come through the Serbian National Committee. So looking back now at the age of the generous age of 52, having gone through archaeology as a career, which has been incredibly rewarding, also been able to pursue my passions in music. And I think really what's tied it together has been education. So I'm looking forward to my fourth career. I'm not quite sure what it's going to be just yet. So there you have it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's actually great, because most of our students just think that they could be just one career. And I think that's a very, comprehensive way of saying, like, we have people who have been successful and then go on to transition in another career, and they have been equally successful in that. Yeah, so I think it's actually great. So I'd just like to know from you, like, in what way has the UWC experience that now your children are studying here, how has it this experience enriched your life, or your perspective?
I'm happy to go first, Gudmundur. That was super interesting, and I was just really struck by the way in which your narrative points out something really, really important, I think, for anybody young thinking about what career to find, which is this idea that, the career you have should not feel like work. It should feel like joy and pleasure, and it should feed the soul as much as it feeds the belly. And I think that's one of those sort of really fundamental, foundational things about people also managing to be successful. Because of course, when you can enjoy the things that you do because they're such deep passions, then you do well at them, and you make them work, and you figure it all out. So in terms of your question, Amrita, I'll just say a few words. It's been an absolute joy to watch Zai going to a UWC, because I think firstly, the sense of how the UWCs have changed as a movement, that's been really interesting to be able to look at it very up close, from a kind of perspective of a young person in the movement as well. But it's also interesting because my daughter also went to a UWC, but hers was she went to AC, so she was in country UWC. And I was very struck by the fact that it feels as though it's been quite a different experience. Obviously, the schools are different, Dilijan and Atlantic College, but I think there is something about going to a UWC in another country which you're not so familiar with. And that's that experience that I watch my son going through, and the love of the new place and the way in which you connect with these different places, but also the people. I think that's quite special, and it's a sort of different experience, I think, from going to a UWC in a country in which you're quite familiar already, So yeah, and I think in some ways one of the striking things for me about Dilijan has been that it feels quite a lot more familiar to me than some of the other schools. So I think there are some values there that are still being maintained. And I think the one that I value the most is the opportunity for all sorts of kids, including especially kids from, non-affluent backgrounds. And I find that really valuable about how Dilijan is, constructs its student body. That there are a lot of children on scholarship, much more, for example, than say Atlantic College. And Atlantic College now, I think the colleges have all had lots of challenges financially, but it's very nice to see a college that actually supports students on scholarship in such large numbers.
Yeah, that certainly resonates. That's a good question, Amrita. I mean, that's a lot of what you're saying there, Pervez, resonates with me in my experience of the UWC movement. I've had the great fortune of visiting a number of the UWC campuses, And I went out to the heads conference in Dilijan actually a few years ago. And I spent a few days first in Yerevan and then out to Dilijan. And I was just so taken by the country of Armenia and by the Dilijan campus. What an extraordinary place to be. So I'm thoroughly jealous of my son. I wish I had the opportunity when I was his age to go to UWC. Iceland sends 2 students to Red Cross Nordic every year. And so unfortunately, young Icelandic people haven't had the opportunity to really go to the UWCs in the same ways maybe as many other countries have had. So that's one thing on my to-do list, to try and maybe formulate an Icelandic national committee. That would be very exciting. But having worked in Norway and as I say, visited a number of the schools, it's also been really interesting to see how the UWC movement has developed and changed over time. You know, you have these, as they call them, legacy UWCs, you know, where you have that sort of model of having those 2-year groups, the DP, the IB diploma, and being in fairly, usually quite remote locations. And of course, that's all part of the UWC philosophy of bringing young people from all over the world to work and live together and learn together in often quite remote places. And that affords them opportunities to work together in ways in which you just couldn't do necessarily in the same way in a big city. But then, of course, you have then these other UWCs like Singapore, Southeast Asia, like Maastricht and other places where the model is quite a different one, where you have children, you know, coming in from a very young age, and then you have all the age group represented in primary and secondary education. So that's been interesting. Having been the rector of Red Cross Nordic, yes, I mean, these are challenging places to be in many ways, incredibly fulfilling and very rewarding. And the aspiration of bringing people from such a wide range of backgrounds, as Peter was saying, this incredible diversity, this deliberate diversity, is just extraordinary. But of course, brings about so many challenges. I mean, in Norway, we had some refugees that had come to the school. We worked with the SOS villages, children's villages. We had some functionally disabled students on campus. And in some cases, we had students who had very limited formal schooling. And then to bring them into that environment, and then you add into that mixture the IB diploma and all of the rigor and pressure associated with that diploma. And at the same time, try and marry all of that together with having an experiential outdoor program. It's an incredibly ambitious aim. Some people would go so far as to say that it's almost irresponsible in some ways. But I would argue, having been a part of the movement and continuing to be a part of the movement, that it is so worthwhile. You know, the wonderful stories that we have of the students on our campus in Norway, but also across the movement, and the things that they've gone on to do and they've gone on to achieve in their lives and make positive differences in their communities, says it all, really. And hence my continued support of the movement. You know, I really look forward to seeing what Alexander, you know, well, I'm already enjoying seeing what he's taking advantage of in Dilijan, and really looking forward to seeing what he makes of his experience in building those lifelong friendships and having those experiences that will last them a lifetime going forward. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for the input. Yes, we are an intentionally diverse community, of course, and it's great to be here. Yeah, and Alexander is in my TOK class, by the way.
Oh, great.
He's a brilliant student. Yeah, he's very inquisitive and analytical skills. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, I ran a TOK department for many years, Amrita. So my son was actually just texting me this evening. He said, "Oh, I have an assignment in TOK." So
yeah. Yeah. So moving to another question. Who motivated you, or did you have a mentor or a teacher that motivated you and guided you throughout your career journey? Do you think it is important to have someone to be successful? Yeah. Yeah, Dr. Modi, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, lots of people, so many different people, right? Difficult to isolate one or two. Not least, one's family, parents, etc. But school at Atlantic College, certainly there were a number of really wonderful people. I was lucky. I had the two most wonderful house parents who just were funny and warm and kind and just brilliant. And in fact, our community, of that house remains a very strong community even now. We had our 30-year reunion and we all just piled into one photo with these two house parents, sort of like all of us in it. It was kind of incredible. But also an economics teacher who had supervised my extended essay and who had made a condition of my extended essay, which was in economics. And his name was Andy Kumalu, and he was an extraordinary man who'd been on Robben Island in South Africa and made it out. And made it to Atlantic College to teach. And, he was an utterly incredible, again, very funny and inspirational figure. And his condition for mentoring or supervising my extended essay in economics was that I had to go to the project that I wanted to write about, and I had to talk to people there. And in some ways, I think that insistence, which he didn't take long to convince me that was a very good idea, but this business of getting out there and actually talking to people whose lives are affected by things rather than studying them academically at a distance is really at the heart of my discipline of anthropology. And I do regard that prescient, mature advice from him as being sort of really foundational in my experience of learning and seeing that when you go to people and you talk to them, you learn something quite different from maybe the things that people say in interviews or, in sort of more controlled environments. And then, of course, other mentors in the different academic institutions, also some of the activists I've worked with in India, just extraordinarily brave and good people. So lots and lots of different people.
Yeah, that's a good question, Anita. Difficult to make any choices. I mean, there have been so many people along the way who have both mentored me and inspired me. I think probably without a shadow of a doubt, one of the biggest influences in my life have been my parents. My mother, she is deaf. She belongs to the deaf community in Iceland. And growing up with my parents was a real eye-opener in terms of, and I think really in some ways, laid the groundwork for my sort of affiliation with the UWC movement in many kinds of ways, because she experienced injustice, I would say, misperceptions about and prejudice in terms of what it means to be a deaf person. And growing up, seeing that and sometimes just tackling it head on in terms of discussing with people and trying to change people's perceptions, I think was a really sort of a very big formative experience as a child growing up. And then as an educator, I've been blessed with working with such great and wonderful people, whether it be, as I say, in education or within archaeology or within music. I talked about that first teacher I worked with in Belgrade in Serbia, my first teaching job at the international school in Belgrade, who had worked at Gordonstone's and who was such a gentle and kind human being, so generous. And he really, he didn't have to take me under his wing, but he saw something in me as an educator. So he saw some potential in me, and really showed me what it means to be a meaningful educator in a classroom environment and beyond, in terms of being able to foster strong and meaningful relationships with young people, and to And I think also too, I went on to do a master's in education, and my focus was on democracy and critical thinking, and the importance that critical thinking has to play in educational environments. And of course, the importance that critical thinking has is always so important. But looking at the world today, it is so important. It becomes more important by the day, by the week. With the conflicts that unfortunately, rage on in different parts of the world, say in Ukraine and so many other parts of the world, unfortunately. And then you're looking at platforms like Chat GPT, the rise of artificial intelligence, which I think is rising far faster than we could ever begin to anticipate. And I think the progress will accelerate to the point that whereby, there is a danger that these tools start to spin out of control. And so, whilst it's wonderful as well, these technologies are so important. Facilitating the skill sets within young people to be able to critically analyze the information they're presented with, and to be able to select the information that is relevant to them and their context, is really, for me, is just so important. And within the UWC movement, I can see that the young people, the exposure they have in different perspectives from all different parts, so many different parts of the world, and through so many different lived experiences, through that diversity, that gives these young people something that you just simply cannot get elsewhere, I would say. So the relevance of the movement, I would say, is stronger than ever before.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Thank you again. I was just trying to figure out some of the questions, actually. Yes, ChatGPT is a wonderful tool, but again, probably I would be obsolete in a few years. My job will be taken over. You never know. So moving on to next question. So what's the best part of being an anthropologist? What's the best part of your job? And for you, what's the best part of being head of a school? And what's also not so best about it, the mundane part?
So for me, the best part by a very long shot is teaching. That in Cambridge comes in two forms. We lecture in the faculty to everybody who takes the subject in the university, but I'm also a part of a college, King's College, and I supervise students in small group supervisions in college, and that is based on a written piece of work that they do for me. It's continuous. I see them all through the term and through the whole year, and you take them through the course. And so it's quite a personal relationship that you develop with your students, and it's incredible to watch them discover the subject. Their sense of bewilderment when they first encounter social anthropology, and then their sort of eureka moment when it clicks. That's the bit that I enjoy the most every year, especially with the first year students. But then all the way up, to seeing the incredible research projects that some of my PhD students are doing, and to be able to teach full courses, and it's just a great buzz. I had a 9 a.m. lecture this morning, and just the questions that come out of it and the kinds of subjects that our students are interested in, it's just amazing. But I've also done quite a lot of administration in the university, and especially also in my college, and that gives you a different role sometimes with students, and that's also very satisfying because it's immensely humbling, actually, to support students in their lives, as they navigate what increasingly looks like quite a difficult world, a world that feels more and more tough for young people, actually. So tremendous experience, and humbling to watch how much they have to navigate and how much they have to take on board. in terms of wondering where they're going to be effective, what they're going to do with their lives, which way they're going to go. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Pari's the word humbling. Being a head of college here in this school in Seoul is an incredibly humbling experience, and I feel very privileged to lead a community of educators and of children and parents. But at the same time, it's also, it's immensely challenging as well. But that also makes it so interesting. Each day is different. And looking back, we came to Korea in July of 2020, and this was just as COVID-19 was taking hold of the planet. And I feel fortunate of having lived here in South Korea, because the Korean government has managed the pandemic in the most extraordinary way. But at the same time, it's presented our school community, as it has done with so many communities across the world, with incredible challenges. So over the 2 years, I've acquired a few more gray hairs and a few more wrinkles, that's for sure. But I've learned more, I think I would say, in the past 2 years than I've learned in the 18, 20 years preceding that in terms of work. And seeing people work with each other and supporting each other has been just so extraordinary. The levels of kindness and generosity, and looking at our teachers, for example, within the school, they've had to virtually overnight, as I'm sure you had the same, in Cambridge, or whether it be in Dilshan, or moving online virtually overnight. And looking through the lens, trying to look through the lens of young people, and seeing the challenges they face. I'm not sure how I would respond as a teenager living in today's world, because when I was growing up at that age, I didn't have the internet. There wasn't anything called the internet. I wrote letters by hand and sent them by snail mail. Being bombarded with this level of information on a daily basis must be incredibly confusing at times and bewildering. So a lot of what we do in the school is educating young people, of course, around how you navigate your way through such a complicated territory of information. And that sort of comes back to my point about critical thinking, for example, but also around mental health. It's been fascinating being here in this Korean context, for example. The pressures that are placed on young people within Korean society to succeed is just extraordinary. It's on a level that I haven't experienced in other parts of the world. And but of course, as part of that, when I was part of the UWC movement, we used to talk a lot about the mental health of young people, and particularly for children aged 14 to 19, 20 years old. We talked about a mental health crisis, global mental health crisis, and that was just a few years ago. And if anything, that has been exacerbated and become a more significant, more serious problem. So, we've implemented a whole range of strategies. For example, within our school recently, we've had something we had something called the digital detox. After 2 years of being on screens and online learning, we were conscious of the fact that our young people had had so much exposure to screen time. And there is evidence to suggest that it can have very negative impacts on people's well-being and mental health. So, very rewarding, very humbling, exhilarating in many ways, but very challenging.
That's incredible, actually, because what you've been through COVID, and then to handle all those challenges, especially with students and all the logistics, that takes a lot. I'm waiting for some of the questions from our students, but in the meantime, I have another question for both of you. What advice would you have for the current TP1? Because the times have changed, with internet, AI, everything, with so much pressure, like you said. What would be your advice to them?
Mine would be just don't be too anxious about which way your career is going to go. Life is a very long road. And I think lots of young people forget that when they're at this sort of threshold moment of trying to figure out, where am I going to go? Is it the right? I think also much more anxiety than maybe Gudmundur and my generation had about where's the right place. I certainly didn't come to Cambridge because it was like Cambridge University. I wanted an education, and that's what I was aiming for. And I think you can get a lot of good educations out there. There aren't just special places to get them. As we all know, UWC is a good example of that. You know, it's an extraordinary education, and you've already got that. You know what good education feels like. So, you know, be willing to explore what the world has to offer you, and don't be afraid of making those steps, because they may be the right steps for you. They might not be the right steps for everybody, but you know, sometimes it's just good to trust your instincts and to go for the things that feel right for you, not necessarily perfect in some sort of abstract league table world, but it makes sense for you. And I think, you know, looking from the outside, as a parent, but also as a member of the national committee, I can see that more and more UWC students seem to have the courage to be able to do that. And that's a good thing. You know, the world is a very rich and varied place, and actually navigating it is not one path for everybody. So trying to find what your path is and what your way through it is would be my advice. Look for it, it's there. And don't assume that, you know, if you take one step, it's inevitably going to lead somewhere, either good or bad. Each step is part of the journey, and it's equally important.
Yeah, I could not agree more, Perviz, absolutely. I think there can be a great deal of anxiety and of course pressure. You know, the IB diploma is rigorous and tough, and it can be easy to lose sight of what you're trying to achieve. You might not even be sure of what you're trying to achieve, but of course, just the very fact that you've secured a place in such an extraordinary place such as Dilijan, you know, you've already made significant headway there. And I would say, utilize every opportunity that you can within such an extraordinary environment, because before you know it, your 2 years in Dilijan will be gone. They will have come to an end, and you will have graduated. And so take every opportunity that you can, grab them with both hands, and you know, unexpected things will arise. You know, try and test yourself. You know, do the things that you think that you shouldn't really do, or that you can't really do, because once you try them, you will discover that you can do those things, and you will most likely enjoy them. And yeah, I mean, university choices. It's you may think that that's the you know, the be all and end all of the next steps beyond Dilijan, but it certainly isn't. It's only one small chapter, and it's just a few steps, important steps, but those are just a few steps in that long journey that you've got ahead of you. I would say follow the code of conduct as a former rector of UWC. It's very important. Be good, behave, but don't behave too much. But do follow the code of conduct, please. That will make your life a bit easier, and the lives of your teachers. Thank you.
I've got one more thing.
Of course. Yes.
Try and get 6 hours sleep.
I think we are just 5 minutes over our time. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Modi and Mr. Johnson. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your insight. And yeah, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.